Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of May 11th or so, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And today I'm joined again by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks for having me yet again.
So it's been a busy week here in Texas. It's been a few busy weeks, at least in the world of Texas politics. But it's been a busy week for, in a particular way, or at least one particular way. It's been busy this week. Is that we've seen, some of the elite tensions, particularly, though not exclusively, inside the Republican Party that have been ever present in some ways, but certainly brewing over the last couple of years, really break the surface. So, let's start with some of the news in that area. So yesterday, and something that I think most people found not amazingly surprising, although there was some uncertainty in who was going to jump in first. And former Texas State Senator Don Huffines announced that he is challenging Greg Abbott in the Republican primary in 2022. Huffines is an interesting person to do this. Given his background, I think there were some people that found him. I think particularly those that don't follow politics in the state, if you look at this on the surface, I think you'd be justified in thinking, frankly, who is this guy to challenge Greg Abbott?
Or even if you knew him a little bit, you'd say, why this guy?
So, Huffines' background, he was Texas State Senator from, technically 2015 to 2019. He was elected to one of the Dallas area Senate seats in 2014. And in what was an interesting primary at the time that people, is now, 8 years ago, people might have forgotten. But in 2014, he challenged John Corona, who at that point was, a pretty well-established figure. I mean, not beyond reproach. And it's not that, he wasn't without his vulnerabilities, but Corona was, an important chairman and a big player in the Texas Senate. And Huffines defeated him in the 2014 primary as part of what is now, we saw at the time, and I think now still fairly see as the cresting of the Tea Party wave in the Republican Party in Texas. But then what a difference 4 years could make. In 2018, up for re-election, he had an easy primary run, but then was defeated by the Democrat Nathan Johnson, who now holds that seat, and pretty handily in 2018 by 8.5 points. Now, a lot of people that won by a lot in 2018, not to take anything away from Senator Johnson, who it turned out has been a very active and capable member of the Senate. 2018 was a good Democratic year, but still, in terms of thinking about, the who is this guy question, to lose, if you lost by 8.5 points, even in 2018, you lost by 8.5 points. So, Huffines, has an interesting background then also within the party. His brother ran for an open Senate seat in 2018, which he lost in that primary to Angela Paxton, who now holds that seat. Obviously, for those of you listening who will know this, but for full disclosure, the wife of the Attorney General, Ken Paxton. And that was a very bitter, hard-fought primary in which, the Attorney General Paxton also caught a little bit of incoming as part of that, and from the Huffines brothers.
Yeah, it's pretty ugly.
It was an ugly primary. Now, a couple years later, Huffines it has jumped in the race, and he kind of telegraphed this. If you if you go back, to a little more than a year ago, in March of 2020, he gained some attention by writing an op-ed that ran in a couple of the major papers. I think I saw it in the Statesman, but I think it was in a couple. It was picked up here and there. In the early day, and this was the early days of the pandemic, in which, he was in that vanguard of far-right Republicans that were criticizing the governor from early on in the pandemic for the closures and for the effect on business, and what we're seeing is impingements on personal freedom. And technically they were impingements, but seen as unwarranted impingements on personal freedom by the governor in the early period of fighting the pandemic. And then, even as he was declaring, Huffines, you begin to get a portrait of him kind of out there in the right-wing ether of the Republican Party. He also had a walk-on role in the big Washington Post story written by multiple authors that, if you didn't see that, I feel like it raised a lot of eyebrows, but it didn't make quite the splash on social media and in the general discussion I thought it might, because there was so much going on this week. But this is a story about a group that was formed in 2018 to try to cultivate skepticism about the integrity of elections in Texas. And this story was really, on one hand, we'll just call it what it was. There's part of it that was like, wow, what a crazy story. A bunch of guys meeting in this guy's airplane hangar to be briefed, to have their cell phones taken away like at a Dave Chappelle show or something, and briefed on, this set of accusations about election, fraud, and, with tons of walk-ons. I mean, they tried to talk Huffines into being a litigant and to call for a recount, which he declined, and to question the results, but also included Austin's own Laura Presley, who maybe not that well known outside of Austin, but if you follow Austin politics, unsuccessful city council candidate who herself, made loud and repeated accusations about election fraud and a broken process in her loss in her 2018 city council run. But also, lots of people: Pete Sessions, Louis Gohmert, Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, of course, becoming the Rosetta Stone of, right-wing election fraud politics.
Sounds like a Chappelle Show audience.
Yes. Lots of stuff going on in the story. And that story happened to come out on the day, or, maybe the evening before Huffines announced his race. So, Judge, Don Huffines, what do you make? What do you make of Don Huffines? Maybe of Don. Let's put it this way: you've already said, I think, what you make of Don Huffines. What do you make of Don Huffines' candidacy?
Not much. I mean, sorry, that's the quick, short hot take. I mean, it's interesting.
Okay, next topic. No,
we could be done quick. I don't know. It's sort of interesting because, it was pretty clear for a while that somebody was going to emerge as a Republican primary to challenge Abbott. And the truth is, I don't think this is the last one. I mean, there's going to be some number of kind of lesser known candidates than Don Huffines. And there might be some, there might be some more known candidates. I mean, the people, that are, receiving some speculation right now would include Sid Miller and Alan West as possibilities. And
then, as you were saying yesterday, we were talking about, there's always just like some people that are out there that are
always,
the folks we have to include in polling because they're on the ballot that get less than 1% or 1% or something, and that often have funny ballot attractive names or something.
Yeah. Oh, like Larry Secede Kilgore is an example of like one of those. And we know this because we always have to put them on our trial ballot. So we go and we look them up, just figure out, and you get to be called whatever you want to be called on the ballot. So there you go. So, I mean, I don't think this was super surprising. I mean, there's a lot of things I could say about this, and it's kind of hard to know what exactly to think about, which is, I think, kind of what's so interesting about it in the moment that we're in right now, in the sense that, you kind of look everywhere and there's some elite conflict. And, the elite conflict doesn't kind of fit into the neat boxes in the way that we usually talk about it, And so on the one hand, I would say it's not surprising people are going to emerge. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one, I think, despite all the strengths of Abbott's positions, again, we've written recently how his position has weakened over the year of the pandemic, which I think is unsurprising for anybody, right? But he still has, 77% of Republicans approving of the job he's doing. Is it as intense as it used to be? No, but it's still 77%. He still has, $40 million in the bank. Now, Don Huffines, I understand, probably has a lot of resources he can lean on as well when it comes to running a campaign. But,
he has to spend his own money.
He has to spend his own money. That's right. But but that also speaks to something too, which is, it's an interesting moment. It's there's some aspects of this that make ton of sense, right? I mean, you've got a Democrat in the White House and Democrats in control of Congress. I think there are a lot of Republicans who are looking at this upcoming election thinking this is a good opportunity for me. And if that means I have to run over another Republican to get there, so be it. Right. I think there's some long-term frustration. I mean, people talk about this all the time, but in a state that's been dominated by Republicans in the statewide level, and who aren't going on to become president or do other things, you end up with a logjam. And I think there's a lot of people who would like to move up. And so I think there's a certain amount of, of that going on. And then I think the question that's sort of a little bit harder for me to gauge here is sort of, I think, the question that we're all looking at, the sort of, I think, underlying a lot of this elite conflict generally, which is, how much of this, and Huffines could stand in for anybody, but how much of this is, some of these politicians looking out at the Republican electorate right now and saying, I think if I get to the right of anybody on this, I've got a good chance. That if I can create some distance, between Abbott and myself on immigration and border security, election integrity, and my fealty to Trump, maybe I can just slip in here.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of that going on out there right now.
Yeah. I mean, in some way, Huffines' announcement was almost like a parody is too strong a word, but it's, if you're going to write the TV version of somebody that was going to challenge Abbott, in this environment, part of his announcement was, about finishing the wall.
Yeah.
On the border. Right.
Well,
and so that in some ways that almost distills,
funny.
The mood in a very, interesting, funny way.
What's funny is, if you take Huffines' background a little bit, not necessarily his politics, but his background, you'd almost think that Huffines would be challenging him more as like a center-right Republican, just in terms of sort of the businessman. I mean, the idea that, the real criticism with Abbott began with with any sort of shutdowns and mask mandates of business, and the idea that there was a strong sort of business, let's say Republican business community backlash. And I mean,
well, I think the interesting thing about this is I probably only partially agree with that. In that, I think, in the beginning it was both.
Right.
Right. And hence the problem, right? There was the conventional, but I think the kind of center right challenge was to some degree much more mixed than the to Abbott's right challenge, which from the beginning, had a much more Trumpian flair to it. I mean, the business stuff was certainly wrapped up in it, but, and I think, as you were talking, I was thinking, like, as we were talking about, there's going to be all these challengers to Abbott and everyone's running to the right. Will anybody try to occupy that more traditional center right period? I mean, clearly the governor has decided, it seems to me pretty evidently beginning midsummer, that, he is not going to try to occupy that position, at least not, before the general election comes around.
No,
and so, there is space there, but I don't know that there are votes there. Well, it's an empty space.
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, we were sort of talking about this before, and I was saying, my impression sort of, right after the election, after January 6th, and sort of in the first kind of month or so of the year, there was a lot of like press coverage that was talking about, sort of the coming Republican Civil War. And I mean, and the thing that it seemed to me, like, this is my impression of that coverage. So, maybe somebody else has a different impression, but, my impression of that coverage was this idea that, the center right was going to reconstitute itself now that Trump had been kicked from office and banned from social media. And they were going to, try to retake over the party. And really everything we've seen both in Texas, honestly, and nationally since then has actually said, no, whether you want to call it the far right wing, whether you call it the Trump wing, whatever that collection of attitudes and, that's out there sort of on the far side, that's where all the activity is. And that's where it's coming from. I mean, I think about, like the issues the legislature is taking on right now, and the idea that, like, constitutional carry, no chance, no votes, not only two sessions ago, last session, but 2 weeks ago. And all of a sudden it's like, nope, we're going to do it. the idea of an abortion ban without an exception for rape or incest as a possibility is like, well, okay. I mean, but this is the sort of things Republicans here used to try to avoid these kinds of votes.
Well, see, I think you do something interesting there, though, that leads me to kind of, I kind of structure this a little bit differently, I think. So, there was the big post-Trump discussion, which, I think of as, focused a little bit more in the national realm. And I don't know that, I think different people had different expectations about, there was certainly the big question, Trump has lost. How much has he delegitimized himself as a result of January 6th? And he's kicked off social media platforms. What is this fight going to look like? My impression, and, I don't, like you said, I think this is kind of a maybe more Rorschach than analysis. It felt to me like, that was sort of, I don't think anybody's really presupposing the outcome. I think some coverage, felt like, either consciously or unconsciously conveyed having a preference or a dog in the fight.
Well, I don't think
that was in there, but so I think
I don't think it was presupposing an outcome. I just think that the way the coverage, like focused on go back and look at coverage, I guess, of Liz Cheney, 2-3 months ago. And there was an idea that there'd be a bunch of activity in the space. It doesn't mean they were going to win. It wasn't presupposing an outcome.
Yeah, well, and there has been.
Well, but there has been a win, but the win was not with those people.
No, I said there has been a lot of activity in the space. And, and I'm still not quite, we'll see what happens when they boot Liz Cheney. But I think the other piece I noticed in the way you discussed that is that you then also kind of transitioned into like that fight in the legislature. Mm-hmm. And I think that, as we've written, those things are interacting.
Yeah.
And certainly like, Huffines' thing about the wall is, an argument for, that some degree of transference or projection of that national fight into the state level. On the other hand, as you and I have written, absent Donald Trump, is there a pretty strong idea that whether it was the wall or something, there's a pretty strong possibility whether it was the wall or something else, that somebody challenging Abbott would use immigration as the club to try to beat him with, is pretty high based on what we know about our data and what we know about Texas public opinion and the culture. Now, it's a discussion in and of itself, yet to be determined because we're too early in the cycle or in the historical trajectory of this to figure out Trump inflamed these sentiments. Trump, pick your description of that dynamic. I think it's still kind of up in the air, mm-hmm. But I think this does, there is something very, like kaleidoscopic about this conflict at this moment that's always been there. Right. And we've written about this too. There's this notion of, yes, there's a left-right fight going on here. There's, an ideological fight. There's a sectoral fight going on here. It has to do with where businesses line up and then which businesses line up where, et cetera. What's become the now traditional, the business / elites versus the Republican grassroots, quote unquote, which I'm also it has some limited utility, but as long as you know where the boundaries are. And then there's just like basic ins and outs, right? Yeah. Is Allen West, how much more conservative really is Allen West than pick your incumbent, right?
Well, right.
So, there's all of that going on. Now, I think, so, that's there to be sorted out. And I think this is, and the Huffines candidacy is simply the opening salvo in this.
Yeah.
We talked last week about the New York Times article that Ileana Plotz wrote that was, very thick with, Paxton saying this and then having to changing his mind and, accusing the story of being fake news. And Ileana Plotz just kind of said, well, by the way, I've got tapes. So
yeah, you agreed to it being recorded. So
yeah, so but that was full of like Sid Miller and Allen West and Patrick and all of this going on. But we saw another like interesting element of this, which I think is just as complicated, but a little more localized and speaks to this legislative piece yesterday when, in the House on, another front of Republican conflict.
I was going to say the institutional conflict is the one you left out.
That introduces, because I didn't leave it out.
Transitions.
I was headed in that direction.
I'm taking notes.
The House, when the House engaged in a very long debate, as we record this on Tuesday, this debate took place on Monday. during the day Monday and into the evening on HB3, which was the priority bill designed to respond to the powers exercised by the governor during the pandemic. And, as Cassie Pollock, I don't want to be too familiar, Cassandra Pollock in the Texas Tribune, wrote shortly after, described it as a sweeping bill that would reform the governor's emergency powers during a pandemic and involve the legislature during such instances. Now, that really sets the stage for a lot of stuff that was going on. There were, dozens of amendments, that were pre-filed and that were debated. The legislation, the debate, the amendments that got accepted, all illustrated a lot, some shifting coalitions, both within the Republican Party and between Republicans and Democrats. And, it underlines really just how careful we have to be about, to flatten these conflicts. There's a lot of dimensionality.
Well, I was going to say, the other dimension that came up in that also in terms of the conflict was, you could say
state versus local.
Yeah, state versus. I was actually going to make a little more specific. Say state versus urban governments.
Yeah, with increasingly the state being the animated by rural and suburban members. I think in that and that is where we see a little bit of a reversion back to a partisan thing because of a partisan cleavage because of the way that those voters line up in those parties, which we talked about. Mm-hmm. So what does the bill do? The bill does a bunch of things, and with amendments, this will not be exhaustive, but just the main things. It requires the legislature to convene in a special session if a pandemic disaster declaration lasts longer than 120 days. It affirms the governor's ability to suspend state laws during a pandemic and allows the governor to override local orders by county judges and mayors if they contravene these orders. Obviously, an ongoing point of conflict during most of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, and in terms of these institutional assertion, it creates a 12-member legislative oversight committee, much discussed, made up of the heads of the two chambers, the lieutenant governor, the presiding officers, lieutenant governor and the speaker, the key committee chairs. And this committee is empowered to terminate the governor's disaster declaration, to contravene, rules, orders, et cetera, if the legislature is not in session, right? Which is interesting. And that includes that special session. So this is kind of the default, if immediately, as I read it, this 12-member legislative oversight committee convenes and is there kind of looking over the governor's shoulder, which is an interesting.
I wonder if any of this is constitutional. I mean, this is not my area of expertise. It's just
I think we might hear about that, and I think that's why the bill in the Senate that did fewer things that we'll talk about actually called for a constitutional election for this.
Well, yeah, the idea of a legislature, if the ability to call special sessions is the power of the governor, it's odd that the legislature could basically force the executive to engage in one of.
Yeah, well, I think this is written into the the existing emergency statutes. As I looked at it, I think and I could be wrong about this, but I think it carves out this particular. It carves out a class of emergencies that are defined by pandemics, and so distinguishes it from hurricanes. But it falls within that existing statute. I think somebody will certainly let us know if that's wrong. I'm sure. And the governor would also need permission from the legislature to extend the declaration. Some elements longer than 30 days, particularly requiring face masks. Who'd have thunk it? Limiting certain medical procedures, closing or capping business operating capacity. In other words, it gives the legislature kind of a veto over those particular things that were most politically loaded. And, along those things that we were talking about a few minutes ago.
The best example of that was the amendment that would have banned or prohibited local governments from having mask mandates ever.
Right. So
and that was one that originally passed, and then they redid the vote, and they found that it failed. Right. It was 72-71, which is just, again, this is a state where our polling has shown consistently at least 80% of Texans wearing masks when they leave their homes. including, that's 80%. When I say at least 80%, I'm talking about Republicans, but it's higher amongst independents. It's higher amongst Democrats.
Yeah.
So really, as much as
it was 80% overall.
It was 80% overall, but it was
yeah.
Was it still 80%? I thought, okay. Well, anyway,
it was 80% in April still, which is amazing. It was 80% less than a month ago.
Right. So this isn't like, so I mean, at this point, you say, well, it's not that I'm saying that was not controversial. The point was, it was controversial, even though people were doing it.
Yeah. So, then some of the things that got added in the amendment, and some of these were freestanding bills that people then tacked on as the train started to leave the station, people were throwing their bags on the train. So they created the Texas Epidemic Public Health Institute at the health center in Houston, UT Health Center in Houston, and then linked that, and this was an amendment to the amendment, if I remember correctly, and that institute is going to report to the oversight committee, not to the governor, which is interesting. There's an amendment that will prohibit local officials from requiring closures. And then another thing that was a freestanding bill that I think got added to this, an emergency management text system, which is very popular in our polling, as I recall. So this coming in the trajectory, I'm still not exactly sure what I think about all this. I mean, look, one thing I think for sure is that, I don't want to say idiosyncratic, but let's call it the specific nature of the Texas Constitution and the way it reflects the political culture of the state, not to sound like a Texas 306 teacher, but, the idea that, we're going to have the legislature is asserting itself to some degree and in some, noticeable, I think, real ways against the executive here in a way that I think is kind of pretty consistent with the legislative focus, with a bunch of asterisks of the Texas Constitution. And it's almost, we've talked a lot in the last few years about the efforts of particularly Greg Abbott, but to some degree, Governor Perry, but particularly Governor Abbott, to build, to strengthen the role of the executive where he could in a way that, had a noticeable impact, to my mind, on the constitutionally created balance of power between the branches. And it's been a while since we've seen the legislature push back in any meaningful way, frankly.
Well,
in my view.
Well, and I mean, I think, despite 77% approval, that, even though this is an extremely inside baseball kind of debate, I mean, this is not something that, I mean, first of all, think about all the provisions you've listed. I mean, and then again, the shifting coalitions, depending on what the provision is that you're talking about. I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of things in this bill for voters of various stripes to like. I mean, if you're just a Democrat and you're asked, hey, do you want to take powers away from the governor in the next pandemic? The answer is yes. If you're a conservative Republican who doesn't like the way that, Abbott managed the pandemic, there's something for you to like here too. Even if you're a moderate, let's say a center-right Republican, I don't want to say moderate, but a center-right Republican who doesn't like the way the localities handled it, but are happy with Abbott, there's something for you to like here. But ultimately, the fact that there's so much in here that, really places new limitations, reorients the relationship between the legislature and the executive branch, especially around this stuff, shows, to some extent, go back where I started here, how a governor with 77% job approval and $40 million is definitely going to see multiple primary challengers, because the pandemic was a messy thing. And it was especially messy for Republicans who, again, we've said this before, but pandemic requires, a large government response, and it requires people to behave, to engage in collective actions, which is doesn't really cohere with Republican ideologies. It relates to limited government and individual responsibility.
Right. And these are things that we know are, kind of animate, the political culture and animate.
Well, and animate the kind of people who get active
and
and really activate the types of politicians and the types of, voters who get activated in Republican primaries to a greater degree. I mean,
and we asked about this, and we got 55, we asked people, do you support or oppose limiting the emergency powers of the Texas governor during a pandemic or similar health emergency? It was clearly aimed at, taking people's temperature broadly on this. And, we got 55 support and 40% oppose. And to your point about, this is, these kinds of institutional questions, you're automatically asking people to think about things at a level that a lot of people don't think about. So we got 18% saying, I don't know.
Yeah, well,
but there was a lot of, but there was a lot of Republican support, even if it was closely divided. I mean, it was 43-45 among Republicans.
Well, and I'll put it this way. If you're a Republican voter who had heard anything about this conflict before us asking you this question on the survey, you're probably a Republican primary voter. It's just too, I mean, it's just such you have to be paying a good amount of attention. I mean, just from all the other polling we've done where we talk about sort of, nexus of government power type questions, it's just not something a lot of people are thinking about.
Although I would say this is probably a little more salient than usual.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because of the context of the pandemic. And it's like, these stories were not on, these were not A4 or even B1 stories. These were A1 stories as the governor was being challenged. So I think, only 11%, although, to your point, 21% of Democrats and again, a third of independents, no surprise there, had, said they didn't know in response to this question, but only 11% of Republicans said they didn't know. So,
right.
But one doesn't want to undersell the degree to which, as we watch this unfold on the floor, there was some classic log rolling going on here. I mean, there was a little something, you kind of said this, I think, in a slightly different way, but at the level of like what was going on in the room yesterday, in the chamber yesterday, there's a little something for everybody. Some of the Republicans, the primary Republicans or, kind of activist Republicans, if you will, got these assurances that local prerogatives would be hemmed in. Call them legislatively institutional Republicans who felt like for whatever reason, the legislature should have had more say, got a little something out of this. There was a little something for everybody. Democrats got some more legislative oversight and some science out of this. So, the way this unfolded was an interesting example of how the House works, right? And how the legislature works. Now, having said that, what we should say is that, if the House gives its, if this survives third reading, which I'm pretty sure it will, it's unclear what the Senate is going to do. There's no companion bill, so this is going to get shipped over to the Senate. The bill that they voted out was very different from this, required the governor to call a special session in order to declare a state emergency that lasts more than 30 days, but also included a potential constitutional amendment, right? So that would require the approval of Texas voters. So it's unclear whether the House and the Senate are actually going to settle. But going into a primary election, that's very interesting.
That's another one of those. Was that the Senate, pushing its preferred option, pushing an option and knew it wasn't going to go anywhere, or waiting for the House to deal with the mess of it and see what came out?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of that, as there is in any session. There's been a lot of that going on between the Senate and the House on this. So there's a lot of cross currents here.
I want to clarify one. I want to be fair to Don Huffines here, Senator Huffines.
Yes, your conscience is bothering you a little, is it?
Well, a little. I don't want to be too flip here. And part of the reason, you said, what do you think of his candidacy? And I said, not much. And it's not because, he's not potentially a credible candidate or he won't fund himself. The thing that I've actually been thinking about in all of this is the fact that, the delayed census count is going to make this really hard for challengers. I mean, ultimately, everybody knows who Abbott is. Everybody knows who Patrick is. People know who Paxton is. And so ultimately, to the extent that, for Republican elected officials who enjoy pretty solid job approval numbers amongst Republican voters, the delayed calendar on that means that, other Republicans who are going to come forward. What I mean is another Republican who's going to come forward and seriously have to challenge Abbott is going to have higher name ID than Huffines to begin with. I think they're going to have to come in with a little bit of a coalition or some of their own voters, people who voted for them statewide before. I think that's really, if there's going to be a serious challenge, it's going to have to be someone like that. It would have to be, and I'm not speculating in any way, but it would have to be a Patrick, it'd have to be a Sid Miller, it'd have to be a Ken Paxton, it'd have to be somebody else, I think. I mean, even Alan West, I think, I think that's a challenge for him, except that he'd be on TV like all the time. But I think that's the one thing. So when I was saying, I don't think much of it. I don't think he's the right person to put up a strong challenge against Abbott.
Yeah,
in the context we face.
Okay, you should feel good about that.
Okay, just want to throw that out there.
I mean, I do want to say that if there's a delayed primary, one could also argue that it might be helpful because it gives them more time. Now, if the field gets more crowded, as you're saying, and then it gets harder for Huffines, but a delayed primary, I think overall, if you're an incumbent, it's generally, all things being equal, it's not good. Because, it just creates more space for, things to happen or for whoever to build support. Now, it doesn't negate all of your advantages. That's why it's kind of an all things being equal thing. But
yeah, I mean, another element of this I think is going to be interesting to play out in the future in terms of all these conflicts you're talking about is the role that Abbott's money plays in down ballot races. I mean, he's sort of positioned himself or been positioned by others or propositioned by others as the savior at various points using, his money and his operation to help down ballot candidates. And so, the idea that there's all this conflict about, I'm curious to see how much that sort of, translates.
Yeah, I mean, I would be more definite about that. I mean, I think that, that was a strategy, and it's a strategy that they've undertaken purposefully. And,
they weren't giving away the money for fun.
I think that's, that they definitely, did that on purpose and will do that again, I think, to the extent that they have it and that they'll have the money to do it. So we wound up going back, but
sorry, it's my conscience.
Yeah. So at that point, I think I'll just, call an abrupt end to this and say, for those of you listening, it'll be interesting to watch this bill and see how these institutional politics play out some more as the legislature enters its final frantic weeks. And I see no signs that it's going to get any less frantic. So we'll be back probably with things to talk about on the legislative front next week. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our excellent technical crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening. Lots of the data we talked about and much more on our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And we will talk to you next week. Thanks for listening. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.